Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Leadership Deep Dive. My name's Claire Arscott. I'm one of the event managers for CMI. I'll shortly be handing over to our speakers today to run the webinar. I'm delighted to be joined today by Air Vice Marshal Warren James and Wing Commander Emma Keith. Just a reminder to submit any questions, comments or interactions you may have in the chat boxes. We'll endeavour to answer as many questions as we can today. You will be sent a follow-up email with information on today's session. But without further ado, I will hand over to Warren James to begin the webinar.
Claire, thank you very much indeed. And hello to everybody this morning, and thank you for inviting us to partner with CMI for a leadership deep dive. I'm Bunny James, and my colleague Emma Keith is the acting commandant of our own Academy of Leadership within the Royal Air Force. So today we're looking to sort of take a step beyond an original webinar that we had, and to look at two different models: learn, earn and return, and also David Rock's S.C.A.R.F model. So where did learn, earn and return come from? Initially, and if we sort of go through the build to this was really a model around career stages of life. How that we learn throughout our sort of early and formative years, then earn money, hopefully, in a career, and then perhaps at some stage give back to our organisation. But the context of this came from an earlier webinar that I held with Anne Franca, where she gave the challenge of, is keep calm and carry on still a good phrase in a COVID crisis? Now, of course, to be controversial, both of us at the time, myself and Angela Owen, said, no, we need to have a different one. And I came up reasonably quickly with learn, earn and return, having heard that sort of phrase, but felt that it could be repurposed for this generation, and indeed as a way of thinking about how we might do our business. So there's something about COVID and new normal in the way that we might look at learn, earn and return, and I'll get to that in a moment, but that new normal could be your enduring position beyond it. And the one thing I would say about learn, earn and return is it's about the human challenge. What is it about people, about yourself, about your teams, about your business that you are understanding in a changed environment? That could be any changed environment. We happen to have a particularly acute one right now, but that's going on all the time. And what is the so what of it? So if we actually look at learn, earn and return, if we think about learning now, rather than how we got to where we are, but actually where are we today, and what is it that you're learning about you, the way you react, the way you behave, the way you lead, the way you manage, and indeed your approach to the business, and indeed to the situation you find you in. And what are your people doing? What are they feeling, rather than what are they just doing? And how are they managing that? And then what does that mean for you up, down, and across your organization? And then perhaps how you interact with it. And this leads particularly to the S.C.A.R.F model that Emma's going to talk about shortly, to give you some of perhaps the hints, tips, the things to think about of the way you would go about that. When we look at earning then, in this particular environment, we're not particularly looking at money. We're probably talking about earning respect and trust. This is about behavior, a consistency in the way that we approach something. There could be some tips and tricks, and I don't want to overplay that. They need to be sincere. But what is it that you do now that you perhaps didn't do before to gain that respect, maintain that respect? And it's not just about trusting those below you, it's about them trusting you, or to the side of you, them trusting you, those above you. It's got to be a two-way piece. What is the example that we try and set in any environment, but particularly one whereby this may be the only means of communicating for a period? It may be on a phone, it could be on a video call, rather than necessarily walking the floor or talking in a corridor. So how do you remain visible? And indeed, in terms of communication, this might suit a number of you listening, but equally frankly, it may be quite painful. It could be turning you off. This isn't your preferred means. Well, if that's true of you, it's probably true of others as well. It happens to be the one we're using today, but there are, of course, others. And indeed, what we've seen is a almost proliferation of communication means. And we were talking just beforehand of how do we perhaps rationalize those to give us an ability to create some kind of order for our people. But in what way are those that you're communicating with receptive, receiving, and indeed able to give back in a way that they can associate with you, the organization, the values, etc. Having learned again, and it is usually again about yourself, what you do right, what you do wrong, the mistakes you've made, and we all make them. What are you going to do about that in terms of returning that experience back into the teams? And whilst I've put in here, giving back that experience, which is not unlike you might do at a further stage in a career, actually it's the here and now experience that you're learning again, or indeed it's changing. And how do you then empower others to get on with that? What about those who don't want that empowerment, who actually like the direction? What energy can you put back into the organization to show that it's okay, it's a safe space? Maybe you can learn, and we can fail quickly, potentially, in ways that aren't critical, but actually let us realize that everybody is going through some kind of challenge. So learn, earn and return, you could start to expand on in terms of a model within your own business. It's a very simple one. Again, it was designed as almost a sort of catchphrase instead of keep calm and carry on regardless. The regardless doesn't quite work. And indeed, just keeping calm and carrying on won't work for everybody. So how is it that you can make those changes? So having given an overview, what I'm going to do now is get Emma to step in and actually look at the S.C.A.R.F model and particularly start to unpick some of that and hopefully offer you some of the insights and hints and tips that would do this. Now, the S.C.A.R.F model, I should make clear, is not ours. It's not an Air Force one, and I'm sure Emma will cover how and where that comes from. So without further ado, Emma, please, over to you.
Thanks, sir. So we've been learning about the importance of learning and having a learning mindset, and that all makes great common sense. But sometimes we have an air gap between common sense, what we know we should be doing, and common practice, what we actually do. And a really good example of this would be, we know that it makes sense to eat 5 fruit and vegetables a day, but I would argue it's perhaps not everybody's common sort of practice. So what I'm hoping to do this morning is actually to give you some really practical and helpful hints and tips that you can incorporate into your daily lives. So as mentioned, the S.C.A.R.F model was created by David Rock. Now, David is a neuroscientist, but he also coined the phrase neuro-leadership. And that was because he saw such a connection between us understanding how people's brains work to therefore understanding how people work. And if we consider that understanding how people work helps us to lead and to make the most of the leadership opportunities, we can start to understand that synergy. But before we look at the model in any detail, I just want to talk through a little about the current context within which we find ourselves. We're experiencing huge amounts of change, and importantly, everybody is experiencing that change in different ways. And I think that's a really important point. Kubler-Ross created the change curve, and this might be a model that some of you are familiar with. But in essence, in her research, she discovered that people going through change experience very similar emotions to those of people going through grief. Now, it's a really important point to understand that we don't move through the change curve necessarily in a linear fashion. We can move forwards and backwards as different emotions come up. But a really sort of a starter for most people is denial, feelings of anger and confusion, before sort of hitting rock bottom, that crisis mode, really finding it difficult to cope. And then ultimately starting the upward trajectory, letting go, accepting the new order of things, even sort of forming a new level of confidence. You've got through something difficult, something challenging. You can take that learning and move forward with a new confidence. But I think a really important point for leaders and managers at the moment is to be really alert to the fact that leaders tend to move through the change curve faster than the rest of their team. Now, this can explain why a leader can already be accepting of the new order, perhaps even looking to exploit it, seeking opportunity within that new sphere, that new area of which they're working in, and finding that their rhetoric is falling onto deaf ears and not quite understanding the disconnect. And this can be exacerbated further when actually a leader has usually come into contact with material about the change in advance of their team, giving them even further of a head start. So a really important point for leaders and managers right now is to remember that people within your team may be further behind in this change curve and still experiencing really some quite sort of painful emotions as they're moving through it. Now, in his research, David Rock also identified that when we experience social pain, we feel it in a very similar way to when we experience physical pain. And in fact, some really quite shocking research showed that if we have sustained social pain for a prolonged period, it actually shows up in our body in a very similar way to physical abuse. So really quite shocking research. And if you then consider that our biology is also designed to make us more inclined to move towards a threat response than to seek out the positives, we can see how this might start to play out for us in our working lives and in our daily lives. Now, it could also perhaps explain why when somebody sits you down and says that they're getting ready to give you some constructive feedback, you get that slightly sick feeling in your stomach. You know, you're actually taking the social pain and experiencing it in a physical way. And perhaps it also explains why giving genuinely accurate annual appraisals can be so difficult for so many people. But what David Rock did was he looked at what levers were available for people to use to help them move from the disconnect where they're in pain and to move them into a more positive space. And he looked at what these dimensions were. Now, it's really important because for leaders, if you can move people from a place of pain and threat to where they can perhaps identify with the positives within change or within the situation, you can move them from disengaged to engaged. Now, that can be really powerful because if you get your team to be engaged, you unleash discretionary effort. You get that little bit extra. And that really can be the difference between a sort of an average performing team and a high performing team. So let's now look at the model that he created, the S.C.A.R.F model, and the 5 fundamental levers that he said controlled human behavior and helped us move from that threat response to that position of reward. So the first that he identified was status. Now, this is your relative importance to others. Not so much in terms of necessarily your job title or your position, but actually being respected, being recognized and being understood. So really important for somebody who has their prime driver being status to feel that they are respected. So the second driver that he looked at was certainty. Now, somebody who has certainty as their primary driver really wants to understand what's going to happen. They find ambiguity very difficult. So they're going to understand that you're not going to be able to tell them what's going to happen for the next year. But somebody who has certainty as their key driver is going to really want to understand, what do you expect of me today? What do you expect of me this week? Give me as much clarity as you can. So the next one that he looked at as we move forward is autonomy. Okay, so somebody who has autonomy as their driver really wants to exert some level of control over their own situation. So at the moment, they would really want to know that they were able to move themselves from the position of pain or negative response, and they controlled some of the levers to move themselves into a more positive place. So some people won't care at all about status, certainty, or autonomy. but they will have relatedness as their next driver. Now, somebody who has relatedness as a driver is all about the connection to other people. They really feed off that kind of joint environment. Now, this is a really important one, as you can probably imagine at the moment, where many people are working from home, or if they're going into work, they're working differently with social separation. If somebody who has relatedness as a key driver doesn't have that need met for a prolonged period, this can really start to flag itself up in quite a physical way. And we can start to see that stress show and even sort of into mental health areas. So it's one to be really aware of in the current climate. And then finally, his final driver that he identified was fairness. And this is importantly the perception of consistent standards applied to people. And perception is the key word, because the perception is as important as the action. But people with fairness as a key driver really want to know that consistent standards are being applied to everybody. So having had a brief look at the 5 key levers that David Rock identified that can help somebody move from threat to reward, I would like you just to take a moment to reflect. If you had to sit here and be really honest with yourself, which of these is your key driver? Status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, or fairness? Now, if your key driver is not being met, it feels claustrophobic. It feels really uncomfortable. You are going to notice it. Okay, so which of these do you really need to have met? What's your secondary? Okay, what's the other one that you would really like to have met, the need you would like to have met? Because if we have our primary and our secondary, then actually that really unlocks our full potential. It allows us to really maximize and give that discretionary effort. So just take a moment to reflect. Okay, and now I would like you to think about your team. I'd like you to pick the top 3 performers in your team. Pick 3 people from your team. I suggest you pick top 2 performers, and then the third, your problem child, perhaps the person that you struggle to connect to, perhaps the person that you find it a little bit challenging to get through to. And just if you were to take a guess, and we need to be clear it's a guess, but what do you think is their prime driver? And are you using that lever at the moment to support them during this very difficult time? And also to get the most from them and to get that discretionary effort? Under this pressure, are you actually seeing their secondary come to the fore? For example, somebody who's normally quite laid back, perhaps they're suddenly wanting a lot more clarity from you, a lot more certainty. They're finding the ambiguity difficult. Is their secondary coming to the fore under stress? So I'll leave that one with you for something to think about, whether you're maximizing, really thinking about what would work for them. We'll just now look at each of these levers in a little more detail. So status. I promised you some sort of do's and don'ts and some practical tips. So for somebody who has status as a prime driver, okay, you can't focus on promotion or job title. They might not be appropriate, and you might not have those levers, might not be in your gift to give. Okay, but do not undermine somebody who has status publicly. Okay, they will really never forgive you. It will really hurt and it will really impact their performance. So be very, very careful of comments in front of other people publicly. But what you should actually do is really pay attention to the work done. Really give focus. If they've put effort in, make sure you give them constructive and positive feedback. Okay, somebody with status as a high driver is going to really like public acknowledgement. So in front of the team, those team updates, really give them the credit for what they've been doing. Okay, and give them opportunities to take ownership and to really show you that they feel respected and that you really value their contribution. So moving on to certainty. Okay, so somebody who has certainty as their key driver, do not hide information. Okay, they will stop trusting you. They won't believe in you. Don't be inconsistent or create unnecessary change. These people are already struggling with the amount of ambiguity. They really don't need you adding to it. Okay, what you can do to help them is really set this clear vision. Okay, really help them understand the strategy that you're taking. Let them know the what is required and the why, so they can really identify it. Communicate. Now, I actually prefer the word connect to communicate, because you can communicate to your heart's desire, but if it isn't connecting to your audience, then you're kind of wasting your time. It's sort of been proven through research that we need to give the same message between 6 and 266 times for it to really resonate with people. And in fact, the average is in the sort of high 60s. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to repeat exactly the same words and same message that many times, but it does mean that you need to find anchors, your key points, and weave them into your rhetoric on a consistent basis so that they can be really heard. If you don't have the answer now, for somebody with certainty, be honest with them. Back to don't hide information, don't give them more inconsistency, but let them know when you will get back to them. And that will really help them to manage that time in between. So moving on to the next one, on to autonomy. So do not micromanage somebody who has autonomy as a driver. It will drive them insane. They will hate it. Don't make all the decisions. Play with the push-pull continuum, really pushing decisions to the right level. Don't set all the goals. Allow them to have some control over them. We're always much better at achieving goals that we've had some say in creating. Don't force your way of doing things on them. So what I would suggest is you're very clear on the what is required, why it is required, but let them figure out the how and give them that freedom. And don't always put everyone in teams. There's a huge driver at the moment for collaboration, and it's fantastic. Great way to get diversity of thought. But there's also a time for pushing a decision to somebody and allowing them to own it and to control it. Okay, so what should you do? Well, we've covered pushing decisions down to the right level, but maybe offer options, give them a choice, allow them some control. Okay, and then coaching. I would suggest a coaching style with somebody who has autonomy as a driver. So asking them questions, well, what would you do about it? And throwing a little bit of that control to them. Okay, so moving on now to the next driver. So moving on to relatedness. So for somebody who has relatedness as their driver, you really don't want to let the group split or discourage social time. It might not be important to you, but it will be to some of the people in your team. So don't focus only on the result. When you check in, take the time to ask how they are, but most importantly, create the time to actually listen to the answer. Okay, and don't ostracize or exclude individuals. If you've noticed somebody has gone quiet, specifically ask them a question and call them in to the medium that you're using. Try and get them to engage. Okay, do work on team dynamics. There's lots of innovation at the moment in terms of how to connect to people, whether that's catching up for beers at the end of the day via Zoom with your team or just checking in. Okay, there are lots of ways that we can do this. One of the things is about helping people to know you and each other. Actually, there's an opportunity in some of the ways we're working now. And a number of our senior officers have actually commented that seeing people in their home environment has actually allowed them to get more breadth about the person, to understand a little more about them. So there are actually opportunities. And then tell personal stories. So let people see that you are human, laugh about your child running in and Zoom bombing the meeting that you were in the middle of. Let them see that you're human, let them be human to you, and really still work on that connection. So finally, moving on to fairness. Okay, so with somebody who has fairness as a key driver, don't play favorites, okay? And we say this, we know this. This is that air gap between common sense and common practice. It is very easy to play favourites with our time, with our effort, with our interest, and actually, particularly when we're under stress ourselves. But really, really be aware of this. Do not hold people to different standards or be inconsistent in how you make decisions. So what can you do to support them? Well, really increase that transparency. Let people see what you're thinking. Really communicate. Back to this, communicate the why. Let people understand the what, the why. Let them work on the how. Give really clear, consistent expectations. Okay, and the one that I would really pick up on as well is help people see things from other people's shoes. Empathy is one of the biggest things that we can gain as a leader, and to really try and understand what somebody else's situation is like. And that's never been more important than now. People are experiencing this situation very, very differently, and not through any fault of their own, their circumstances, all sorts of different things impacting that. So really taking that time to try and understand from that other perspective. So that's a sort of a run through of the S.C.A.R.F model, and hopefully a few useful sort of hints and tips that you can actually use in your daily lives. And on that, I think we're about to open up the floor and answer some of your questions.
Brilliant, that's great. Thank you very much, Bunny and Emma. And thank you everyone for all of your interaction throughout the webinar. Lots of good questions and comments, and really good to see. So that's brilliant. I'd just like to start with a question that's come in beforehand. And what is your primary driver, and how has this played out in your career, both positive and negative?
Do you want me to start? It's probably easier. Yeah. Okay. And actually, if I may also sort of add, I've been watching all of the live comments. There's some fantastic commentary back and forth come in from there, and people's own ideas. It's probably worth making clear, we're not saying this is the only way, nor is it definitive. It happens to be something that we like at the moment as a service. We think there's some merit in it, and it seems to have talked to these areas. And I think some common themes have certainly come out as well, which is worth covering. The idea of coaching and mentoring and its importance. And actually that connects the two models we sort of gave you, learn, earn and return. When you're returning, what is the importance of coaching and mentoring in amongst that? But you asked what are our sort of drivers. So my prime driver is undoubtedly relatedness. I'm incredibly people centric and people focused, therefore I miss that interaction, and I have no no sort of shame in hiding that, and to a degree that's impacted me during this crisis. Fairly early on in this, I ended up in hospital with what they thought was a heart attack, and it was nothing of the sort. This idea of physical and social pain was an amalgam of an enormous amount of stress doing the job, of how much we're trying to keep going at the moment, because this is just a part of what we do. It would appear I overdid some of my compensating mechanisms around doing more sport, more activity to keep me sort of resilient, and almost did these to excess. And at the same time, because I'm not around the people who are used to me, there was nobody there to sort of go, are you okay? Are you doing that? Is that the right thing to do? And it didn't interrupt my pattern at the right time. And there's a classic piece there of me not only learning, but relearning something I know about myself, in the ability to keep doing stuff almost to destruction. And yet I didn't manage to stop it yet again at another stage of my career. And this was a good salutary lesson in, hey, remember this, learn again. What are you going to do about that, rather than just learn about it? And I think if you were to look at sort of a secondary one, whilst I like a degree of autonomy, and I think you can blend these, actually fairness is pretty important to me across time, because it's how you treat others as well as how you treat yourself. And I've found, on an upside rather than a downside, that if I can connect in ways with people, show that energy, and actually show a consistency of approach back and forth, that's when I'm at my best and I get the most out of people. Do we do all these things super consistently? No, we're humans. We make mistakes. We get it wrong occasionally. Emma, do you want to step in with any of yours?
Yeah, so I think my driver is also relatedness, and I think it's played out for me both positively and negatively. So I think positively, it's allowed me to really connect with people. I think I'm good at understanding people and, really trying to build those relationships in the workplace. I think it has sometimes been challenging because sometimes it's made it difficult to make tough decisions that have an impact on people, and made that sort of uncomfortable. Interestingly, and I didn't know that obviously you were going to say your two, but I think my secondary is also fairness. And I think that has balanced me, actually. So, for example, when I was running officer training, we had a large change program. And obviously with change, some people will be on board, some won't. But I think I feel that if I have been fair to people and I have listened, I have explained, and I have tried really hard to understand, that helps me align it with my relatedness, if that makes sense. So it sort of balances it. I can then make those tough decisions because I've done them fairly, even though they impact on people.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So another one that's come in, could you briefly outline your position on the most effective forms of training and development for middle management and the same for top level management?
Do you want to start, and I'll have a go then?
Yeah. So for me, anything that causes self-awareness and reflection. So I think as you go up into more senior positions, the less people will challenge you, unless you have been very good at creating the culture. But it's harder for people to challenge you, and therefore perhaps that self-awareness can go. And I think as a leader, you have a disproportionate impact on other people. Your energy, what you do, has a huge impact. So anything that creates self-awareness. I'm a huge fan of coaching and mentoring, because I think coaching can be really helpful for that. And I think if people can be mentors, it keeps them connected to the next generation. It ties into the points earlier about giving something back as well, but it keeps that connection. I would also recommend things like having a reverse mentor. So having somebody junior to you in the organization, who preferably is as different to you as you can, who will give you feedback and challenge you and improve your self-awareness. So I think those really good. The other one I'd perhaps add at the really senior level is peer-to-peer mentoring. So perhaps people outside of your organization or industry, but in similar high-level positions, who can share best practice, challenge you, and be a sounding board. So I think those kind of self-awareness areas would be my top things at that level.
So I don't disagree with any of that, and you wouldn't be surprised, because we're both connected through the system that we actually try and employ through our military. But I think there is something in that reverse mentoring. I prefer to just call that two-way mentoring, because in fact you both tend to get something from it. One, you do have to create a degree of trust. But equally, you want somebody who's going to be able to challenge you and speak that sort of truth of the things that you hold dear, to just question those and make them key. And that works from middle to senior management. This idea that one is very different to the other. There is somehow a continuum of experience that works all the way through, and you gain more experience. You usually wish you had it about 5 minutes before you needed it, but that's the way these things go. But there are a lot of this kind of activity, and particularly the interaction, I think you can add. And again, I come back to some more great comments and questions coming in here about how do I do this. We're not telling you exactly how to do it. Here's a great sort of piece on coaching questioning. As you sit and think about this and maybe download it and reflect on it, how are you going to do some of that? You won't do it perfectly. You won't get it all right. Your ability to classify people in the boxes of the S.C.A.R.F model is imperfect, but it's really a case of how you're working on that, and indeed how you then interact with that model. And one or two saying, well, how will I know? Well, how are you having that discussion with the people that you want to do this with, and indeed share it with them, because you'll get some great insight just from the discussion about what works and what doesn't. And by the way, there will always be those who sit absolutely, in my experience, outside of this or utterly resistant. It doesn't matter if they sit inside it and you can see it. They may not be able to. There will be those who are just finding this beyond too difficult, very, very hard to connect with, and it's one of those things of long-term persistence rather than short-term gain.
And I think one other point, so that I would just add as well on that, is that often people have been promoted because they're good at their job, at what they do. That doesn't mean they're necessarily good at leading people or managing people. So it is really trying to invest in those management skills and making people at that senior level realize that you're sort of less of a doer in your job, and you're being paid now more to be a thinker, and to create the right environment and space for the rest of the team. And I think that's a jump that a lot of people find hard as they move to the more senior positions, is stopping being the doer and starting creating that sort of more strategic view.
I think that's right. It's amazing. Somebody once said, how much you involve in all the tactical detail. Some people really are, but actually the higher you get, the more disconnected you become from that. You're actually overseeing all of it and giving others the space to deliver the things that you might have done 20 years ago as a subject matter expert. It doesn't mean you're not still an expert in some things, but letting go is actually really quite difficult for a lot of leaders and managers to a degree.
Absolutely.
Sorry, go on. Yeah.
No, that's fine. Something that people are asking quite frequently at the moment, especially, is how do you hold steady in a crisis where you're dealing with scared people?
I'll take that to start with. I think that, so my organisation's probably around about 10,000 on any given day, and the initial messaging on this was very, very clear. Stay at home, save lives, protect the NHS. Incredibly simple, clear messaging that worked very well, of course. But at the same time, well, if I'm not doing that, one, I'm wrong, and two, I'm now frightened by how you do that. Whereas the reality was I couldn't stop all of our training. Indeed, we needed to regrow it and reconfigure it incredibly quickly. So using a sort of a personal example from the service was how to do that, and indeed then still explain that to people. And it comes back to that. Not every single person is going to buy into the exact same rationale that you've put in your first effort. So you do need to come back to it. There's got to be a consistency and a degree, actually, when people are frightened, of calmness, and indeed, the authority to be able to say, look, here's the facts. You can only lay that out for people. Bearing in mind, we all get bombarded by every other kind of message, and your ability to pick facts from that can be quite difficult, particularly in a modern day and age. So the ability to be consistent, hold that, explain when that's changing. And it does change, and this is a great example through COVID. Here the regulations change, here the relaxations change. Okay, so we are now changing our position based on what? And it comes back to Emma's point earlier. Can you explain the why rather than the just do it? Because just do it has a time and a place. Usually when there's a fire or an emergency, get out now. It's really obvious, what have you. The rest of the time is being able to create that time to create a why. And indeed, if you're then having to go into certain cohorts or certain areas or certain groups who have a similar mindset or a similar job or a different sort of perhaps the threat level to them, making that bespoke and specific to them. It takes time, but it is time worth taking.
Absolutely. Thank you. Maybe one for you, Emma. Can you talk about red team thinking and how this might help managers in the current situation? I understand this practice is used in the US Marines.
Yeah, so I think red teaming is really, really important. It's a way to challenge our assumptions. And I think in most organizations, we have assumptions that we've just accepted. That's how it is. So being able to challenge them is really important. What's really key is, who is your red team? Sometimes it's the person who knows absolutely nothing about your business who will ask the why question. But I don't understand why you're doing that, and make you really stop and think. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but there's a brilliant film called Moneyball, and it's to do with baseball. But actually what it's really to do with is saying, if you do things in exactly the same way, ultimately the person with the most resources is likely to win. What you've got to do is do things differently and think differently. And an accountant comes in and challenges the way that a team is constructed, and it's a true story. but he sees it from a completely different perspective. And that's what you're trying to do is red teaming, is get a completely new angle on it, a completely different diversity of thought. But we can also red team our own ideas. And a couple of sort of hints that I would use is a great question to ask at the end of any meeting, particularly when you discuss something important, is what are the unintended consequences of this? Rarely asked question, but to me, a brilliant question to ask at the end of a meeting, because it makes people think slightly differently. And you can also use tools such as 180 thinking. So say you're running a project, spend some time thinking what you'd have to do to make it fail. It's amazing how much more creative our brains are when we put them into the negative. And you'll think of all the things you could do to make it fail. And actually, then it's really helpful to sit and look at it and say, okay, I need to do the reverse. So you can red team your own thinking to a certain degree, but always great to get that diversity of thought, someone new and a new perspective.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So we've had a lot of questions submitted. I'm just going to pick one here, possibly for you to answer, Bunny. If you just bear with me a second. Okay, so the question's not appearing on the screen.
Yeah, no, got it.
Oh, there we are. Just taking the time.
So people working from home, their own space. Do we have any tips on balance of visible leadership and being there for them with intruding on your team, or without, I guess, intruding on our team during this difficult time? Well, gosh, okay. So there is something about visible leadership and contact, as we mentioned earlier. And again, that that speaks to me because of the relatedness issue. But I also have team members who don't like that intrusion or would prefer to have some of their own space and time, or they like it in a smaller group rather than a bigger group. So how do you actually have the ability to interact individually, or at least in small groups with them, or who knows them best, or indeed have they got the ability to have that voice to effectively go, I really don't want this. Do I have to join in with the Friday night sort of drinks? Do I have to do that? And creating the space for somebody to say no, but at the same time they don't just disappear. Particularly if we all have introverts and extroverts. We all have those who are more private or less private. So how do you actually sort of look at that team? And some of it's how well you know them. I think actually the more difficult piece in here, and there was another good question that sort of fits with this, is when you join a new team in the middle of this, how do you get to know them? That's genuinely difficult. And we've got people moving around at the moment, and they're having to feel their way through this. And but of course, it comes back to the question you asked. It's a bit like Emma. If you can give people the room and go, so not a sort of shut question is everybody happy, because they'll all sit there either very quiet or go yes. It's more a case of giving an open question of how would somebody like this to be done differently. What would work for you in a different way and at a different time? If you want to get hold of me individually, please do, so that we can actually work this out. And if I may just cover another one of the questions here, somebody sort of said, oh, well, if you treat them differently, will it look like they're a favourite? Well, that's also possible, but how do you explain that to people? And of course, if you're starting to use something like this, but at least a discussion with a team of go, look, we just don't think or act or work or take information in the same way. We all know that. Right now we've got that out there. So who is it's a visual learner? Who is it likes lists? Who is it likes it orally? What is it that they're going to accept and take? And can you cope with some of that at the same time as the massive information keeping the business going, or at least being able to explain, look, we're going to do it this way because it's quicker, more efficient, but I accept that doesn't work for everybody. We'll try something different at different times. So that's a long answer, but it hopefully covers 2 or 3 bits around the same time. But for us, we're doing a mix. We do a morning check-in just to see how everybody is. Twice a week I have a team brief on what's actually going on inside the business. On a Friday, for some people, we do we call it a happy hour, but actually it can be a mug of tea and your favorite sticky bun. It doesn't need to be anything else, and it's nothing to do with work if we can possibly help it, or it's actually the ability to have a bit of a let off steam. And I think that's the other thing. People think, you need a trusted environment for that. but we all need somewhere to go and go, that was just rubbish, or that treatment wasn't right, or that didn't work. I need that as much as anybody else does in the organisation. How do you create that?
Yeah, excellent. So we've got time for a couple more questions. So the first one being, COVID-19 has taught managers to understand that employees can be in a tough situation and hence allowed them flexibility and relaxation, which might increase their satisfaction and performance. Will it have an impact on the conventional way of doing things for managers?
Do you want to start, Emma? I have a view.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. And I think that that can be a real positive. And this is where, as a leader, you can really shape that space. You know, this is about treating people as individuals and really recognizing the differences of what they need. So, for example, at the moment, you know, I'm homeschooling 2 children as well as working. And, you know, for me, I'm working in different ways. Other people on my team will be working in different ways. And it's not just about people who have kids. When we go back to work, you know, some people are night owls. You know, they work their best at 11 at night. Why can't we tap into that and use that creatively? So to me, it comes back to this allowing people to do the how and really supporting. I think we've often judged people before on FaceTime rather than output. If we get better at judging output, we might be surprised that the person who's sat at their desk all day is not actually delivering as much as the person who's got a healthy balance and is perhaps more productive. So I think there's quite a lot in there that we can take forward. I think one thing that's really important to me is creating an inclusive environment where everyone can be their best self. And what does that mean? Well, I think a lot of people talk about people fitting in. I actually hate the phrase fitting in, because if you're fitting in, you're making probably unsustainable or at least unhealthy adjustments to fit in. I prefer let's fit together. Let's be a collection of individuals moving in the same direction that are fitting together, not fitting in. And fitting in is that company when you walk in and they all look identical, you know, and they've all got the same suits. Look at us, but, you know, they're in a different environment where they have choice. But they have, you know, they have the same suits, the same shoes, the same haircut. They've probably been to the same schools, you know. Actually, you know, this is about creating an environment where you've recruited somebody for their talent, their ability, and you don't whitewash it out of them. You allow them to then work within the organization and the structures and the values that are important for the organization, but you fit together, not fit in.
I think that's a really good saying. The irony, I was laughing there, of the 2 people in uniform, you know, being ununiformed. But I think that's really important. I suspect a lot of people look at us and assume who and what we are and what we think. And actually, I regularly will stand on a stage or do something and say, we're probably not who you think we are. And I think that's quite important. This idea of inclusivity is huge. It's flexible working, isn't it? But on a scale and in a way that we've kind of talked about, we've kind of imagined, we've kind of gone there a little bit for some people, some better than others. I mean, there'll be people out here listening who are, you know, that's their model of business. But on the whole, models of business weren't like that. COVID is forcing that. It's actually forcing us to change quicker. There's a lot of work. If you've got to do things so many times to change a culture, it probably takes 5 to 10 years to really change a culture in an organization, or you need a strategic shock. And whilst you wouldn't choose one, if you get one, then it does give you an opportunity. We are definitely seeing a new normal in certain parts of the business emerge very quickly. We've moved things digitally that we've talked about moving for ages, and they are more efficient. And it's giving people exactly what you've discussed, an opportunity to work when they want, how they want, where they want. That doesn't suit some people. I happen to like some time in the office along with others, but I've got others who'll be very happy not to do that. And of course, that then gives you different models of your travel and subsistence, your cost basis for your fixed facilities. Now, what do you want to do around that, rather than I've got to do that for this means that it doesn't suit people? What's changing as a result of this, I think, is huge, and I think it will continue to change. I think we're only starting that now. Some businesses, I think, will be much better at doing this, a bit more reactive. You know, we're such a big monolith that I think we're learning quite quickly, but we've got quite a long way to go.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant, thank you. And we've got time for just one more question. Can a leader distill or enhance other people's well-being? How does emotional intelligence play a role?
Oh God, well, so I'll go on. I'll start this time. It's a great question, and it's a great question because it it depends on the leader's own sort of sense of themselves and others, their own sort of emotional quotient, I guess, as to and the empathy point that Emma made earlier. Do they have that? Do they have a connection? Do they have the trust? Are they able to make that leap into other people? And how much can you sense from a phone call or a video Skype or something else? And it does rely on time and persistence. It relies on wanting to and being able to ask those questions and being open yourself to both criticism and indeed showing fragility, is my personal opinion. You don't always get it right. You've got to, it comes back to my point of earning. How do you earn the respect and trust? Not how do you respect and trust others? How can they respect and trust you such that you can actually gain that insight into them? And we come back here quite nicely to a much broader idea of coaching and mentoring across a whole team, rather than necessarily, you know, the one-to-one that people tend to associate with. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. It's really powerful. And both mentoring and coaching, not the same thing. But how do you do that on a bigger basis? And I would pretty much guarantee, if I sort of threw it out, there'll be some who are good at this, some who are not, some who know it's a strength and a weakness, some who are utterly blind to it. But that's definitely worth working on because you'll get so much more out of people if they can do that. Emma?
Yeah, so I agree with all of that. And I would add, so for me, emotional intelligence, it starts with self-awareness and a genuine desire for self-awareness. But then you have self-management. So self-awareness, I can know I have a fault or an issue. Self-management is actually doing something about it. And back to my point at the beginning, that as a leader or a manager, you have a disproportionate impact on the people who work for you. So how you turn up for work impacts their day in a really quite a significant way. So I think you have a real responsibility to not only work on your self-awareness, but your self-management. And I'm not saying that's easy. It's not. It's hard. These are habits, ingrained character traits that we need to be really aware of and really working on. The other point that I would make is to improve our self-awareness. It is really listening properly. That can be 360 feedback, reports, annual appraisals, asking for feedback. But the listening properly is the key word. I think a lot of people think they're listening when they're not. And a lot of people listen to respond. So the other person's talking, and in their head, all you're thinking about is your reply, the point you want to make, what you want to get in. Actually, what we should be really trying to do is listen to understand. And if that means there's a pause before you can go back with your point, fine. Because maybe by listening to understand, something they say might subtly change what you were going to say, and you suddenly find a greater connection. So I think that listening, really good listening, genuine self-awareness, and then be honest that there's a difference between knowing you have a fault and actually doing something about it, and the impact that that can have on others and on their energy.
Yeah, that's really good. The idea of reflect rather than react, I think is really powerful from what Emma said. And just at the beginning there, he says responding, was the idea of the leaders do need a bit of a game face. Actually, you put on, and it's not necessarily armor, but you do need to be able to develop an ability to be consistent. So there is a game face as to how you go into a situation. You'll get out of bed and feel rubbish, but you still need people. They still want to see you lead. You've had a bad day because your report wasn't so great or something didn't go well. Where is it that you make that space to learn that piece and reflect on it, but at the same time are still trying to do the same for other people? Emma's point is really well made. This is difficult. It's human, and it's hard work, but it's worth the effort.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much to both of you for your time today. The session has been fantastic, and thank you, Bunny and Emma, for sharing your insights and expertise. If you're a member of CMI, you can access Management Direct, which has a whole range of practical resources to help apply your learnings from today. For anyone new to CMI, or those who haven't heard of Management Direct portal, it's professional development opportunities, including over 400 videos, 10,000 journal articles, ebooks and more. So thank you to everybody for joining today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.